Okay, welcome to today's webinar on switchback experiments with Delivery Hero. I'm joined by Iulian from Delivery Hero. He runs product experimentation there. And I've also got Bertil from my team. He's on the customer data science team, but he's an EPO member as well. And I'm your host, CJ Towell. I run product marketing here. I'll be kind of guiding the discussion today. So the first things we'll talk about, one of the major elements of today is going to be what a switchback experiment is. It's good that everyone has the same context and the same understanding because that'll come up a few times today, including the demo at the end. So I'll run through kind of what those are, what they're used for, and so on. And then we'll open it up to Q&A with Iulian. I've got a bunch of prepared questions, but if you have any of your own, there should be a Q&A box either at the top or the bottom of your Zoom. I'm not sure which view you're looking at right now. But wherever that Q&A box is, go ahead and type those questions in and we'll ask those. And then Bertil is going to take us through a lovely demo of how to set up a switchback experiment in EPO. Okay, so answering the first question, what is a switchback experiment? I'm not going to read out all of that. Essentially, you should know that in a typical A/B test, you would assign a treatment to a user, and then they would kind of experience that treatment throughout the course of the test. Whereas a switchback experiment, you're basically switching back and forth, hence the name, from treatment and control across an entire group. And I have a good visual on the next slide to help you understand that. So why would you do that instead of a traditional A/B test? Sometimes randomization is not possible by user. With EPO, we make that a lot easier, but in general, that can be a challenge if you don't have a good way to target these users. The major thing is it controls for time and context-based variations. So if you do kind of see shifts through those, switchback experiments can kind of level those out. And then most importantly, what my two examples are going to be, it basically lets you evaluate that performance in different environments under different conditions. And so what I mean by that is if you want to test just one small part of a change to a two-sided marketplace, say, for example, a rideshare or a food delivery platform, very fitting for today. If you want to test one small part of that, say, giving users a 20% off coupon, but only giving 10% of those users that coupon, that could have knock-on effects we call spillover effects or contamination across the rest of the network where those users get better treatment, maybe their NPS scores go up when the rest of the user group doesn't. Essentially, you're not getting the full picture of what would happen if you implemented that change across the board because the A/B test that you've run is introducing contamination across that group. It's similar with multi-sided marketplaces or even just online shopping. Say that you expose a price to a user and they see the lower price, the test price, and then they come back a day later and they see the higher price. They're going to know that there's some way to potentially get that lower price, and maybe they'll just refresh a whole bunch or ask their friends for a coupon or something like that. You're not really getting a full sense of kind of what that experiment would do when rolled out to the entire group. So here's the visual I promised. In an A/B test, you can see that certain users are assigned to test, certain users are assigned to control, and they basically stay within those groups through the entirety of the test time period. A switchback test will typically be clustered by a different location, and you can see that at 9 a.m., everyone in Madrid, so say in the instance of Delivery Hero, every rider, every user is getting the test experience, whether that's a coupon or a new algorithm or some sort of rider incentive or something like that. Everyone's getting that at the same time, so you can see how the entire population reacts to that change. And then they switch back to control from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., switch back to test, and so on in these kind of staggered intervals so that you can see what the impact is. And so with that explanation, I'll hand it over, or I'll introduce Iulian. What we'll do now, we'll do Q&A. So I've got some prepared ones. I'll stop sharing here. And then if you do have any questions, please submit them and we'll get to those as well. Okay. So thank you, Iulian. So I talked a little bit about switchback experiments. How is Delivery Hero running those today?
First of all, hi everyone, Iulian here. I'm the PM leading experimentation at Delivery Hero and previously at Glovo. And yeah, first of all, I think it's good to kind of explain what is Delivery Hero. So Delivery Hero is a group that basically has several food delivery and q-commerce delivery platforms across the world. So you might know some of them, for example, Glovo, Foodpanda, Talabat, Baimen, Foodora, so and more in Latin America. So these are practically three-sided marketplaces, right? So we have the way the business works. You have a customer which places an order to a store, for example, for a dish. Then you have the store that accepts that order and starts preparing it. This is the second entity, and the third entity is the courier, which picks up your food or your item and then brings it up to you as a customer. So it's quite a complex setup, right? Even more complex than the two-sided marketplace in ride-hailing, for example. Now, in most of the features that we're building, we are actually running regular A/B tests, and we randomize on things like customer ID, courier ID, or store ID. But in some cases, that is not possible, right? So I think it's interesting to discuss now, like, okay, what are the cases where it's not possible or not recommended to run a regular A/B test? So one simple use case and where we are not doing A/B tests is where the feature that we want to test or the idea we want to test does not apply at an individual entity level. So for example, underneath this whole marketplace, there is something we call a matching algorithm, which takes the orders that are placed and then tries to assign them in the most efficient way to a courier, right? So you cannot do an A/B test here for a particular courier or a particular order, because the feature itself works at the whole marketplace. When I say marketplace, usually this is a city or maybe even an area for a bigger city. So in these cases, when we want to, for example, we will continuously work on improving our matching algorithm, and we want to see what's the impact of our improvements, we are doing a switchback. Now, the second use case where you could think about like, okay, what else could we test for switchbacks? For example, you could think of the inputs that are going into this matching algorithm. So for example, let's say that we are using time estimates in order to feed the matching algorithm to put, to assign the best order to the right courier. And let's say I'm a team that works on improving the accuracy of these time estimates, right? So in this case, I'm just improving an input to the bigger system. But in this case, I can, let's say if I improve the time estimates, I can do, and I want to observe the impact of that, I can do it in two ways. The first one would be if I run a regular A/B experiment, I can actually measure what's the improvement on the accuracy itself. Let's say we improved the time estimates by 10%, but you don't know what's the marketplace level business impact, right? So that's when you are doing switchback in order to understand how improvement in time accuracy have led to a better marketplace efficiency with a simple metric like delivery time, for example. So this is a secondary case, and maybe a third case is things related to features or changes that might be put at individual level, but again, you want to understand the interactions at the whole marketplace. So for example, you're changing something that's very popular across marketplaces is like this surge pricing or like fees that are being adopted based on demand, right? So if you want to understand what the impact of that at marketplace level, you need to run a switchback.
Thank you. And we're getting our first questions. So I blacked it over to you just so you can see that too, but I'll read it aloud for everyone. So can you talk a bit about how to handle carryover effects? How substantial do carryover effects need to be to invalidate this type of design?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So I can explain for myself, then also Bertil can chip in. So what I would say is important to understand for your business, like what is the thing that you are doing, right? So for example, in our case, we have orders. An order typically lasts somewhere between 45 minutes and 60 minutes, right? So I know that when I design my switchback experiment, I need to choose what are the size of the time slots I'm randomizing. So for example, I can randomize every day or every 4 hours or every 2 hours. So you need to do research to understand what is the right slot size for you, for the things that you're trying to test there. And then how many of our orders, for example, would cross from one slot to another. This is one aspect to take into account. And then what should be the burn-out period where we discard the orders that are transgressing from one slot to another. So this is kind of how we handle them on our end.
Okay, thank you.
I think the question about carryover is really, really important and something you want to pay a lot of attention. The example that Iulian gave, where you have which rider is picking up which order, you know that within 20 minutes, the order's arrived. Within an hour, that won't necessarily have any kind of effect. So that's a really good example where you can have slots of 1 hour, 2 hours, maybe 4 hours to cover a meal period. A day would be probably the longest maximum day, it makes sense. But you have other marketplaces where the interaction is a lot longer. For instance, we have a client that does ads for people who come to your home and fix things, DIY task. Typically, they don't come in within 20 minutes. And so in that case, we would recommend a switchback on the longer period for how to pick and select someone to come and help in your house. We also have clients who are dating apps. And so for them, you can make recommendation, you can have an exchange of like swipe left, swipe right, and make friends. But if you want to see what is the impact on them starting conversation, what is the impact on them having a date, of course, we'd recommend a bit longer periods. There's a point where those interactions are too long to justify a switchback, but it's absolutely something you want to pay attention to. One way to measure if the switchback is working properly is to look at you have a period where you have the event, and you look at what happens in the period before. You're in period during treatment, but the period before was in control, or you're in period in treatment, the period before was a treatment period. If those two have significant difference, you know that you have carryover effects, and you know that you need to extend the duration of your period. And that's a very easy test that we can walk you through how to do on IPA.
Perfect. Thank you both. Okay, another question. A lot of these are rolling in. I'm glad to see that. What information do you capture in a switchback test to understand the feature exposure, as in who was affected?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it works kind of the same with regular experiments where you have exposure events. So for each request that your service is doing to the SDK that does this randomization, as you would pass, let's say you have users that you are regularly randomizing on. You are doing requests, passing these users, but allocation to the variant is done based on time. So you send this exposure event, at least we do, we send this exposure event for each request. But then you also have another piece of data which is stored in your system, telling you like what is the expected exposure, how does the calendar of exposures should look like, right? Yeah, so that's kind of what we do.
Okay, and one more question. Switchback tests usually have much lower samples. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is a longer discussion, right? So one caveat that's very well known with this type of experiment is that your power is much lower, and because simply the number of units that you have is much smaller, right? So instead of millions of users, you suddenly have, I don't know, 100, 200, 1,000 units, which a unit is, in our case, is a market plus time slot. So for example, yeah, we'll take Barcelona for this 4-hour slot. So what we do to improve that, there are several things what we can do. So one is basically we need to increase the number of slots, right? So how can you increase the number of slots? You can decrease the time slot, the time size. For example, you can say, okay, I will run 3-hour slots instead of 1-day slots. Is that okay? Yes or no? You need to research that. The second thing we do is to also make it wider. No, how can I add more slots if you have this capacity to extend, add more cities, or maybe divide it into areas and have a larger number of areas. So that will also increase the number of slots. Then what you can also do to improve this is to think about the randomization algorithm. So switchbacks is not just A, B, A, B, A, B. You can also randomize it in a way that it makes it more powerful. And then in the end, you can also have some statistical adjustments like applying QPAC in the analysis pipeline.
Okay, thank you. If you have any more questions, please go ahead and submit them. All right, what are some improvements to the product or key metrics that came from learnings from a switchback experiment?
Yeah, I mean, going with the example we were discussing before in the matching algorithm. So the team working on the matching algorithm, they continuously improve it by either making the logic smarter or adding more features to the machine learning models and so on. And practically, we have seen improvements by doing switchback experiments in our key metrics, such as delivery time or even number of orders that we can serve, right? Because in the end, you have a limited supply of couriers in the market. Let's say you have 100 couriers in the market and you have demand that's coming into how much of this demand can you satisfy with this fixed amount of supply. So yeah, it has a direct impact on our business, I would say.
Okay, perfect. And I'm looking at a lot of these questions. A lot of these we have answered, so that's great. Addressing a lot of the questions out there. A little bit of a behind the scenes look. Iulian did help us at EPO develop our switchbacks feature based on his requirement. Iulian, when working with EPO, what were your key requirements for a switchback experiment analysis?
Yeah, that was really interesting because we collaborated with the designers and the statistical engineers from EPO. Practically, just to give some context, we are using EPO in Delivery Hero as the analytical platform for measuring our A/B test results, but we also run switchbacks, right? And in EPO, switchbacks was not yet a capability, so we were requesting for it. And when we were doing that, we also kind of explained how our system works, what is our data model, how to make it compatible with our data model, right? For example, can you support different randomization algorithms in how we split the time slots, right? Can you support different sizes of the slots? So it had to be fairly flexible. Then another requirement would be that it should be basically the flow in which the user interacting with the platform should be fairly similar to what they're used to, right? So it's kind of, we can reuse the same metrics, for example, we don't have to redefine the facts and so on. So reusability was one of them. And then we had discussions around the statistical method, right? So we wanted to ensure that the statistical regime applied onto the pipeline is appropriate and is correct, right, from a statistical point of view. We had some discussions there. And last but not least, it's also about compute, right? So we know that switchback experiments can be quite heavy because you run it very wide. There's a lot of data there. So making it compute efficient is quite important. And maybe one last point, which is a bit more funny, is switchback experiments are also notoriously produce notoriously high or bad negative results, especially in the first days of the of the experiment, right? So just by chance, let's say you have, I don't know, a special event today and that fall into the variant treatment, suddenly your metrics go up or down, and people that are not very accustomed or not very knowledgeable about how this works might derive the wrong conclusion on the wrong date, right? So putting guardrails into the platform and into the UI against that is very important as well. So people don't jump up to conclusions.
Very good to know. Thank you. We had one more question roll in. Do you use any formal methods to know when to use a regular A/B test or when to use a switchback? It may be that the A/B test is still more accurate due to a larger number of observations.
Yeah, at least in our case, if you can run an A/B test to test your hypothesis, you should do that, right? So we don't recommend switchbacks unless you really need to. So this is a very simple principle that we're following.
Okay, thank you. So now we'll head over to Bertil's section. We'll show a little demo of how switchback experiments work in EPO. Bertil. Why don't you take us through it?
Cool. So yeah, this is Hippo. If you haven't seen it, this is our demo instance. So that's why all the tests are going really, really well. And if you want to implement switchback experiments, it's just as simple as a normal experiment with one tiny nuance. You're going to create analysis, the button in the corner, where you can create all sorts of exciting experiments. We'll click switchback analysis. You need to give it a good name. So I'm not very creative, so I'm going to call it demo switch. I'm going to pick a team. Let's pick a pricing team. And I'm going to write an hypothesis. Not very inspired today. I recommend you have a bit more idea for hypothesis. And then the first thing we ask you is, what is the units? In the case of a switchback, it's a city, a market, a region. So in this case, we're going to pick a region. And that Epo then immediately says, okay, for that unit, I have assignment logging table and I have switchment assignment logging tables. What are those? When you define a switchback, you basically have the principles. So these are the squares in red and green that tell you in the zone 1 on Wednesday, you should be in treatment. In zone 3 on Wednesday, you should be in control. And you have the individual users who connect. The way this works is that for Hippo, we actually want to have those two information in separate tables. One that tells you when it starts at midnight, when it stops at midnight for the entire zone, and another table that tells you customer 123 connected at that point and they were assigned to control, customer 345 connected an hour later and they were assigned to treatment. And so that looks like two tables that are just normal assignment tables you have in Hippo. The switchback assignment looks like a normal assignment table. If you're familiar with Hippo, you recognize everything here. And we have a special switchback assignment. That one is a little bit different because that one is for certain markets, what is expected variance? And rather than have the moment you were assigned, you have the starting point and the end point. And you notice that for a certain market, you can change between control and treatment depending on the time of day. That's how switchback works. So you have the switchback assignments and the switchback assignment switchback. Not very creative name, and we can select them in the selector there. You can add an entry point if you want to, and then you pick what is the analysis entity. So that is the unit that you care about. Most of the time we recommend users. For switchback, because we cannot have a user who's like lasts a very long time, session, like maybe something that lasts 20 minutes is probably a better entity to use for that. But you can use any entity that makes sense for you. And then you can use the default setting, or you can use right settings, like for any kind of experiments. You click on next. There you have the decision criteria, which is what are the primary metrics you want to use. We can pick any metric that was already configured at the session level. Iulian mentioned earlier that one of the key things was reusability. This is fully reusable. Any metric you've defined at the session level is reusable here, and you can add a guardrail if you're interested in having extra guardrails. And now you have the ability to pick the decision criteria, which is by default, if you improve your key metric and you don't have any negative effect on the guardrail, you recommend to roll out the metric. Having those preconceived decisions allow you to run experiments faster because you know what to do next, unless what you have is you want to have a discussion with your team and you want to explore a little bit further. But having most cases covered by a pre-made decision is really helpful to run a lot more experiments. Click on next to go through a couple of extra details. And then the key thing you want to do here is to name the experiment key. You have already all the experiments that have been pre-checked because Hippo has access to your data warehouse. And you can say, here's name and control environment 1. And we've also know when the experiment starts and end. We know how frequent they are, so we have all the pre-configuration. The one thing that is unique with Switchback is you have the ability to define burn periods, burn in and burn out. So you exclude the last 5 minutes of the period, and you exclude the last 2 minutes of a period in case you worry like interactions effect at the border. You can use different event dates, but I don't think it makes a lot of sense for a switchback. Once you've configured that, you can start the experiment. By the magic of cooking show, here's what the experiment looks like after running for a couple of weeks. You can see the standard experiment result that you would have for any experiments in Hippo. The results are really good. That's very exciting. Just like in experiments, you have an hypothesis. We expect takeaways and make decisions, extra links, visualization to understand what's happening, and I can look at the overall effect it has over time or analysis in detail. And so if you want to explore any kind of detail, any kind of results, you can click on the export chart and you have the ability to create your own export charts for any kind of experiments. So this is incredibly powerful, and we hope that you'll be able to run a lot of very exciting experiments with Hippo. Any questions from the chat on the demo?
Okay, none have rolled in so far, but I'll give everyone a little bit of a chance to get your question in if you've got one. And I do agree, Bertel. I think it's very exciting and very powerful, but I'm biased. Okay, does the platform publish alerts or a summary to our private Slack group?
Absolutely. Sorry, I feel like I've missed the most valuable thing that we have in Hippo. When you start an experiment, you can configure the ability to connect a Slack workplace. And so that will tell you in a private channel, hey, this experiment is now ready for rollout. And we'll share the decision, the recommended decision we make. In this case, it's to roll out the variant, but it can be to roll back if we see negative results, or it can be you probably want to discuss because you have a biggest result.
Any final questions before we wrap up? Okay, how is the schedule of Switchback defined?
That's a really good question. It's for you to define it based on your own business solutions. If, like Iulian, you're very experienced in running Switchback, we trust you. If you want any kind of support, we'd be more than happy to have a team of customer data scientists, myself, and a lot of my more knowledgeable colleagues to help you how to run Switchback. I've run a lot of Switchback like that at a competitor of Delivery Hero that shall be nameless. My colleagues have also run a lot of those experiments, so we're very familiar with how to set burn-ins, how to set periods, what are the kind of things you want to pay attention to. So we'd be more than happy to help you understand what makes sense. But this is something that we will work with you to set properly.
Perfect. And that leads into the next question. Bertel, could you comment on the use of burn-in period? I can imagine burnout period protecting from carryover, but the burn-in period?
The burn-in period is for people who might have logged in on the website, they see a different experience, and then somehow they're signed a little bit later than after they join in the website. It depends a bit on like how your experiment is configured. Whether you need one or not is like it depends on like details about the implementation. So I run a lot of experiments where we didn't need either because we put the separation during nighttime where we had no activity. But that's like a decision that you need to make on a tactical basis.
Okay. And are there back-end integrations enabled for the groups who want to be more hands-on instead of using the UI?
Absolutely. We have a full API connection. I think Iulian can talk about how he's been able to like connect every aspect of Hippo through their own internal system.
Yeah, so Apple, what Bertil shown you through the UI, it's also everything you see there is available through APIs. So we have done an integration between our systems and Apple, and basically our backend creates experiment analysis, get back results, and things like that.
Perfect. And then how do you deal with interference between switchback experiments and ongoing A/B tests?
I mean, here, I wouldn't say there is an interference. The interference, if there is any, is at functional level, right? At the thing that you're trying to change, right? So, for example, if you're changing delivery fees in one market through an A/B test and delivery fees in one market through switchbacks, that would create a parameter clash. And you would probably, your systems should detect that you have two values for a given request from two different sources.
The
Gotcha.
more
Oh, go ahead,
generally,
Bert.
last thing I showed was like this categorical result. So you can very easily say, hey, we have another experiment. Those users are exposed to a promotion or no promotion because of another experiment. And you can very easily say, is my switchback experiment behaving differently based on what I know about other experiments at the same time? It's very easy to set it up in Hippo to say those two experiments might interact. I just want to make sure that it's not something odd is not happening at that level. I've seen that happen very rarely, and usually it's like a very obvious case of, yeah, we should have those two teams should have talked to each other beforehand, but it's really good to have like the ability to detect that in Hippo.
Okay, and I think we covered this, but I'll read this question out loud, and if there's anything else to add, you guys can chime in. But when running multiple experiments in parallel, does EPO do anything to prevent interference?
as I mentioned, you have the ability to set up an interference. It's a very rare event, so this is something you want to think a bit about to avoid false positive. But yeah, that's something we happily walk you through how to implement that.
Okay, perfect. That does it for the questions. I want to thank Iulian so much for joining and giving this very educational session. I learned a lot and I enjoyed myself. And thank you, Bertel, so much for joining and taking time out of your day to show off the demo and to help me out with this. Folks, visit us at getepo.com if you'd like to learn more about the platform. You can get a demo, you can sign up for a preview account, anything like that. And then be on the lookout for this recording in your email inbox. So thank you, Iulian. Thank you, Bertel, and I hope you both have great evenings.